The wind on the high plain spoke a language of its own, a desolate tongue that promised nothing but emptiness. It scoured the land, peeling away loose soil and worrying the sparse, hardy grasses until they bent in permanent submission. Along a forgotten spur of track, where the iron rails bled rust into the dirt, sat a single boxcar. It was a husk, a metal skeleton abandoned to the elements, its paint long since blasted away to reveal a hide of pitted brown. This was where Agnes and Beatrice had come to ground. At 18, the world had shed them as easily as a snake sheds its skin. The orphanage doors had closed behind them with a final, unforgiving click, leaving them with one thin blanket apiece and a shared, silent understanding that they were now entirely alone. They walked for 2 days, following the ghost of the railway line, until they found it. The boxcar was not a home. It was a cavity, a wound in the landscape. But it was also shelter. They climbed inside, the great sliding door groaning on its track, and the wind's constant sermon was muffled to a low moan. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the gloom through countless cracks and holes. It smelled of decay, of forgotten cargo and the dry, metallic scent of its own slow disintegration. That first night, they huddled together under their too-thin blankets, the cold of the metal floor leaching warmth from their bodies. They did not speak of their fear, nor of the impossible odds stacked against them. They had never needed to. Their thoughts moved in tandem, a silent current flowing between them. As the moonless dark pressed in, the decision formed, solid and clear, not in words, but in the determined set of their jaws. This metal shell would not be their tomb. It would be their fortress. The work began at dawn. It was a slow, meticulous reclamation, a battle fought not with force, but with patience and ingenuity. Every day was a campaign of sealing and securing. They gathered clay from a nearby creek bed, mixing it with tough, dried grasses to create a daub that they painstakingly pressed into every crack and seam of the boxcar's walls. Their hands, raw and chapped, became tools of precision. They worked in a rhythm that was both practiced and innate, a silent choreography of shared purpose. One would hold a patch of scavenged canvas taut against a larger hole while the other hammered in bent nails, straightened over a small fire. They moved as one organism, each anticipating the other's next action. Their search for materials took them to the periphery of Prosperity Gulch, a small, hard-scrabble town that clung to the edge of the plains like a stubborn burr. They never entered the main street, never begged. Instead, they haunted the edges, the trash heaps and abandoned lots, their eyes scanning for anything the world had deemed worthless. A broken crate became a source of sound planks. A discarded horse blanket, though riddled with holes, offered squares of precious wool. They moved like ghosts in the early morning light, their haul gathered and carried away before the town was fully awake. But they were seen. Eyes watched them from windows, noting the strange harvest they collected. They found a small, cast-iron stove, its door hanging from a single hinge and its belly full of rust. To any other soul, it was scrap. To them, it was a heart. They dragged it for 2 miles across the rough terrain, the metal screeching a complaint against the stones, their muscles burning with the effort. They did not rest until it was safely inside the boxcar, standing in the corner like a dark, promising idol. Their labor was a quiet prayer against the coming cold, a testament written in mud and splinters. The people of Prosperity Gulch were not unkind, but they were deeply suspicious of anything that did not conform to their own hard-won understanding of survival. Theirs was a world of loud effort and visible strength. A man was measured by the breadth of his shoulders and the ring of his axe against a tree. Wealth was counted in cattle and acreage. The silent, almost invisible industry of the twin sisters was an anomaly, a puzzle they discussed over lukewarm coffee in the general store. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, leaned on his counter, his gaze drifting towards the distant tracks. "Saw them again this morning," he announced to the room. "Dragging that busted stove. Got a pile of wood out there big enough for 3 winters." A rancher named Garrett, a man whose confidence was as vast as his land, let out a short, derisive laugh. "What are they gonna do with it? Live in that old rust bucket?" The first big wind'll peel it open like a can of peaches. Another man chimed in, heard they're patching it with mud. Mud! That'll hold about as well as a prayer in a sandstorm. The consensus was clear, the girls were fools, touched by hardship, engaged in a pointless, pitiable exercise. Their meticulous stacking of firewood, each piece cut to a uniform length and arranged in a crosshatch pattern for air circulation, was seen as a strange obsession. The townspeople chopped their wood in frantic bursts when the mood struck, piling it in untidy heaps against their houses. The sisters' slow, daily accumulation was a source of mild amusement. Agnes and Beatrice were aware of the whispers, the sideways glances when they skirted the edge of town. They felt the weight of the town's judgment, but it was a pressure they had known their whole lives. It was external, irrelevant. Inside the boxcar, their world was governed by different laws: the law of thermal dynamics, the conservation of energy, the simple, brutal truth of the coming winter. They ignored the laughter and the pity. They continued their work, lining the repaired stove with smooth river stones to hold the heat, stitching the salvaged wool squares into thick, heavy curtains to hang over the door and the few small openings they had left for ventilation. Their focus was a shield, their silence a fortress more impenetrable than the metal walls they so carefully reinforced. The world began to change, not in a sudden shift, but in a series of subtle, ominous whispers. The fierce blue of the summer sky softened to a pale, milky white that seemed to hang lower, pressing down on the plains. The wind's voice changed, its summer drone deepening into a mournful, prophetic howl that spoke of ice. The birds fell silent. The coyotes, usually bold and loud in the evenings, seemed to have vanished. If you have ever lived where the seasons are not suggestions but decrees, you know this feeling. It is a primal understanding, a tension in the air that hums just below the level of hearing. In Prosperity Gulch, the old-timers felt it in their bones. They would squint at the horizon and mutter about the look of the clouds, about the unnatural stillness that sometimes fell between gusts of wind. Sky's got a hungry look to it, one might say, but the younger, stronger men would dismiss it as the usual grumbling. They were confident in their solid log houses, in their large, open fireplaces that devoured wood with a comforting roar. They saw their preparations as sufficient because they had always been sufficient. For the twin sisters, these signs were not whispers, they were commands. Their pace, already steady, became imbued with a new urgency. They made one final, desperate trip, dragging back a large, heavy sheet of tin roofing that had been torn from a barn in a past storm. This they secured over the weakest section of the boxcar's roof, weighing it down with heavy stones. Inside, they laid a floor of dried bracken, a thick, springy layer that they covered with more scavenged canvas, creating a crucial barrier against the frozen ground. The great sliding door, their main entrance, was fortified with a heavy wooden bar they had fashioned from a fallen cartonwood limb, fitting it into iron brackets they had pulled from a derelict wagon. Their meager supplies, a few sacks of flour, dried beans, salted meat, and a small barrel of rendered fat, were arranged on shelves with the precision of an apothecary. Nothing was wasted. Every object had a purpose and a place. The contrast was stark: in the town, a noisy confidence and a flurry of last-minute activity; by the tracks, a silent, methodical finality. The sisters were not just preparing for a storm, they were preparing for a siege. The first flakes arrived not as a gentle dusting, but as a statement of intent. They were large, wet, and heavy, clinging to whatever they touched. In Prosperity Gulch, there was a brief sense of relief. About time, Garrett the rancher boomed to his neighbors. A good snow to settle the dust and water the winter wheat. Children ran outside, trying to catch the flakes on their tongues. The initial snowfall was a novelty, a picturesque blanket that softened the hard edges of the town. Inside the boxcar, Agnes and Beatrice watched the world dissolve into white through a small, strategically placed peephole. The door was already barred. The stove was lit, not roaring, but breathing a steady, efficient warmth. A small kettle simmered on its surface, letting out a faint, reassuring hiss. The light inside was golden and warm, a stark contrast to the draining grayness of the world outside. The wind began its assault. It started as a low moan, the sound of a distant train, then steadily grew in pitch and volume until it became a physical force, a high, unholy shriek that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the air. It drove the snow not down, but sideways, a horizontal blizzard that erased the horizon and turned the world into a churning vortex of white. In town, the novelty curdled into fear. The wind found every crack in their well-built homes. It tore at shutters and rattled windows in their frames. The snow began to pile up in astonishing drifts, burying fences and rising against doors. The era of brute force began. Men swore as they fought the gale, trying to nail loose boards over windows, their hands growing numb with cold. Their loud confidence was being systematically dismantled by the storm's sheer, indifferent power. Their shouts to one another were snatched away by the wind, their efforts feeling small and futile against the overwhelming onslaught. The blizzard was no longer weather, it was an invasion. The storm was a beast, and the railcar was a small, indigestible stone in its belly. The wind slammed against the metal walls, and the entire structure groaned and shuddered in protest. The sound was deafening, a constant, shrieking roar punctuated by the percussive impact of ice and debris. It sounded as if 1,000 hammers were trying to beat their way in. The world outside had ceased to exist. There was no up or down, no land or sky, only the roaring, white chaos. Yet inside this maelstrom, an island of profound calm persisted. The careful application of mud and grass, the salvaged canvas, the patched wool blankets, every small, painstaking effort now paid its dividend. The wind could not find purchase. The cold was held at bay. Agnes moved with a slow, deliberate grace, checking the seals around the door, her fingers tracing the lines where their work had been most crucial. She found a small trickle of fine snow blowing in near the floor and packed it tightly with another scrap of cloth. Beatrice tended the stove, the heart of their sanctuary. She did not feed it, she nourished it. Each piece of wood was added at the precise moment it was needed, maintaining a consistent, radiant heat that filled the small space without waste. The stones lining the stove glowed with a dull red energy, a captive sun. They sat on their canvas floor and ate a simple meal of warm bean stew, the steam rising from their bowls in the warm, still air. The chaos outside only served to amplify the peace within. Their small world was ordered, secure, and warm. Miles away, but a world apart, in Prosperity Gulch, that order had shattered. The roof of the general store had given way under the impossible weight of the snow, collapsing with a great roar that was barely audible above the storm. Garrett's home, the one he had boasted was as strong as a fortress, had been breached. The wind had torn a shutter from its hinges and blown out the window frame, and now the blizzard was inside his house, a screaming, freezing dervish that coated every surface in a layer of ice. His neatly stacked but poorly protected firewood was buried under a 4-foot drift, soaked and useless. He and his family huddled in a single room, wrapped in every blanket they owned, their breath pluming in the frigid air as they listened to the storm devour their home. The blizzard entered a new phase of malevolence. The temperature, already dangerously low, plummeted into a realm of absolute, lethal cold. The wind shriek became a solid wall of sound, a pressure that made the ears ache. The railcar, once a solitary object on the plains, was now gone, completely entombed beneath a colossal drift. The snow, their enemy, had become their final, most effective shield. Buried deep within the White Mountain, the boxcar was insulated from the worst of the wind's fury. The sounds from the outside world became muffled, distant, as if happening in another country. The only remaining link to that world was the thin stovepipe, their shelter's single lung. Beatrice knew, with the instinct of a creature in its burrow, that it was becoming blocked. The smoke in the small cabin was thickening almost imperceptibly, the air growing heavy. Action was required. It was a risk they had foreseen, a possibility they had planned for. Agnes secured a heavy rope around Beatrice's waist, anchoring the other end to a support beam. They unbarred the heavy door, and for a moment, the storm tried to force its way in, a blast of Arctic air and blinding snow that felt like a physical blow. Beatrice, her face covered by a thick wool scarf, crawled into the narrow tunnel they had dug near the door as a sort of airlock. She pushed her way upward, into the heart of the white fury. For 30 seconds, she was part of the storm. The world was a meaningless, roaring chaos of ice particles driven at hurricane force. She could not see, could not hear, could not breathe. She worked by feel alone, her gloved hands finding the stovepipe, clearing the impacted ice and snow from its cap. The task complete, Agnes pulled on the rope, a steady, insistent pressure, reeling her sister back from the precipice of the void. Beatrice tumbled back inside, covered in snow, gasping, the cold clinging to her like a shroud. The door was barred again. The warmth of the stove began to thaw her frozen clothes. Their foresight, the rope, the airlock tunnel, the shared trust, had turned a potentially fatal crisis into a manageable task. In the town, a young man, frantic with worry for his fiancée's family, tried to make his way across the street. He took 3 steps from his door and was swallowed by the whiteout, his desperate shout a tiny, insignificant sound instantly erased by the wind. The fury could not sustain itself forever. After a day and a night of relentless assault, the first signs of the storm's exhaustion began to appear. The wind's constant, high-pitched scream descended back into a deep, mournful howl. The relentless drumming of ice against the buried railcar ceased. The pressure on the walls seemed to lessen. Inside, Agnes and Beatrice felt the shift. It was a subtle change in vibration, a softening of the world's hard edges. They had endured. They had survived the climax of the blizzard's rage. There was no celebration, no sigh of relief. They were too weary, too steeped in the discipline of survival. They simply continued their quiet routine, tending the fire, melting snow for water, conserving their energy. Their bodies ached with a deep fatigue, but their minds remained sharp, focused on the next necessary task. A new sound, or rather, a new lack of sound, began to permeate their shelter. A profound, muffled silence fell over the world. It was the silence of burial, the sound of a landscape suffocated under a blanket of white so deep it had absorbed all noise. The storm had passed, but the world it left behind was a new and dangerous place. The ordeal was not over, it had simply changed its nature. The immediate threat of the blizzard had been replaced by the lingering threat of its aftermath, the crushing cold, the impassable drifts, the isolation. They knew, with a certainty that needed no discussion, that the town would be crippled. The loud confidence of its people would be frozen solid, their brute strength solutions shattered. The sisters checked their supplies again, their calculations subtly altered. They were no longer counting just for 2. A new weight, a new responsibility, had settled upon them in the great, white silence. They waited another full day. They listened to the snow settling, groaning under its own immense weight. They ate, they slept, they maintained the quiet rhythm that had kept them alive. Then, on the morning of the 3rd day, they decided it was time. Unbarring the heavy door was the first challenge. A solid wall of packed snow stood behind it. There was no pushing it open. They used their single, short-handled shovel, a tool they had salvaged from a burnt-out farmstead months ago. They began to dig. It was claustrophobic, exhausting work in the narrow confines of their home. They shoveled the snow into a corner, where it would slowly melt, creating a large, slushy pile. They worked in shifts, one digging while the other rested, until finally, after hours of labor, they broke through. They emerged not into a landscape, but into a tunnel of their own making. Beatrice crawled out first, blinking against the sudden, shocking brilliance. The world was an incandescent white, a surreal dreamscape sculpted by the blizzard. The sun was out, but it offered no warmth, its light reflecting off the snow with a painful, crystalline intensity. The plains were gone. In their place was a rolling sea of white dunes, some as tall as a house. Familiar landmarks had been utterly erased. It was a new, pure, and terrifyingly alien planet. Agnes followed, and they stood together, 2 small, dark figures in an endless expanse of white. They looked towards where Prosperity Gulch should be. They could see the tops of a few roofs, the black smudge of a chimney. From one, and only one, a pathetic, thin trickle of smoke curled into the still, frozen air. Then they saw movement. A figure, struggling, floundering through the chest-deep snow. It was Garrett, the rancher. He saw them, or rather, he saw the impossible column of smoke rising from a massive snowdrift where nothing should be. His face, visible even from a distance, was a mask of gaunt disbelief and frost-nipped desperation. He staggered, fell, and rose again, his eyes fixed on them as he stumbled forward. The survivors of Prosperity Gulch emerged slowly, like creatures crawling from the wreckage of a world they no longer recognized. They were hollow-eyed, shivering, wrapped in soiled blankets. Their homes were violated, filled with snow and ice, their supplies ruined, their confidence scoured away by the wind. They saw Garrett stumbling towards the impossible plume of smoke and, with what little strength they had left, they followed. They gathered at a distance, a small, huddled group of disbelievers, and watched as he approached the two sisters. Agnes and Beatrice stood their ground, waiting. They were not figures of judgment, but of fact. They were wearing warm, patched clothing. Their faces were drawn with fatigue, but their eyes were clear and steady. They were alive, and not just alive, but whole. They were a living refutation of everything the townspeople had believed about survival. Garrett finally reached them, collapsing to his knees in the deep snow before them. He was shaking uncontrollably, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. He looked from Agnes to Beatrice, his gaze filled with a desperate, uncomprehending awe. He tried to speak, but his lips were cracked and stiff with cold. "How?" The word was a broken whisper, a puff of frozen air. Agnes did not answer. She simply met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Beatrice turned without a word and descended back into the snow tunnel that led to their home. The townspeople watched, silent and confused. What could possibly be inside that mound of snow? A moment later, Beatrice reappeared. In her hands, she carried a small, covered iron pot, from which a faint warmth emanated. She also held a small, tight bundle of dry, splintered kindling. She knelt before the shivering rancher and held out the offering. The pot contained glowing embers, carefully preserved from their stove. "Start with this," she said. Her voice was quiet, devoid of triumph or pity. It was a simple, practical instruction. Garrett stared at the embers as if they were jewels. He looked at the dry kindling, then at the two sisters, and finally, at the dark opening in the snow that led to their impossible shelter. In that moment, he, and everyone watching, understood. Their strength had been noise, and it had been silenced. Their wisdom had been arrogance, and it had been buried. The sisters' survival was not a miracle, it was a result. It was the final, unassailable sentence in an argument they hadn't even known they were having. The parable was complete. The quiet, meticulous foresight of the dismissed and forgotten had triumphed over the loud, ignorant confidence of the crowd. They looked to the sisters, no longer as outcasts, but as their only guides in the cold, new world.